So you finished the first draft of your fantasy novel, and now you're wondering, how do I turn this messy pile of words into a story that someone actually wants to read? When I finished my first fantasy novel 12 years ago, I had no idea what to do next. I spent 4 years trying to edit that book, and a lot of the time it felt like I was making absolute zero progress. But since then, I've developed an editing system which has allowed me to publish 4 fantasy novels, which have gone on to get some lovely reader reviews. I've taught this process to many of the 200 plus writers I've worked with, and today you and I are going to walk through my entire editing system step by step so that you can learn how to craft a better story. The first concept to cover here is what I call the 2 golden rules of editing. If you don't know what these rules are and you fail to follow them, it's going to lead to a lot of mistakes in your editing process. So, to explain the first rule, when you finish the first draft of your story, your fantasy novel is going to look a little bit like this. There's just problems everywhere. Some of these problems are really big, other problems are a little bit easier to solve. Now, the mistake that a lot of new fantasy writers make is they'll look at some of these big problems that I've got up on the screen here, and they'll go, man, those look way too difficult to tackle. I'm going to start my editing by knocking out this little problem first, and this little problem here, and then I'm going to fix this little problem here. And maybe these are little things like just trying to tweak a few words that a certain character says, or try to make the descriptions from one character's perspective a little bit more in tune with their personality. But the problem with that is that you have neglected this massive glaring issue in your story. And that problem might be something really big, like the fact that you have 3 point of view characters, but one of those point of view characters feels unnecessary. And the issue with starting with these smaller problems first is that you may realize you've just wasted your time. You may have spent all this time fixing these little small issues in your manuscript, but because there's this really big problem there, the story is still suffering. Instead, it's much better to identify what is the single biggest problem in your story right now, and then focus all your energy on that. In this example we're going through here, perhaps the biggest problem is the fact that we've got 3 point of view characters, but only 2 of them are needed. So if we knock out one of those point of view characters, you may actually find that some of those little problems disappear. Now you're not worrying about making that character's dialogue sound distinctive because that character doesn't exist anymore. So this brings me to the first golden rule of editing, which is that you always want to work from the biggest edits to the smallest edits. This saves you so much time. I cannot emphasize this enough. I remember with my early writing, I would do this mistake all the time where I would focus on making these little tweaks when I would start an edit, and then later on I'd realize, oh no, those 10 chapters that I just spent all that time meticulously polishing the prose or improving the dialogue, I had to cut them all. And so those weeks or those months of effort were completely wasted. The second golden rule of editing is to do everything you can to stay objective about your story. This is really the fundamental skill of editing. It's being able to take your rose-tinted glasses off and see your story as it actually stands on the page. Of course, that's easier said than done. So as we go through my editing process in the rest of this video, I'm going to be sharing with you some tactics that will actually allow you to have that genuine, realistic objectivity when it comes to editing your own work. Okay, with those 2 golden rules covered, let's discuss what you should actually do when you finish your first draft. The first step, of course, is to celebrate. This is an amazing achievement. I've seen so many writers that I've worked with reach this milestone in their own writing, and every single time I see, a member of my guild reach the end of their first draft, or one of the students who went through my outlining program finishes the first draft of the book that we helped outline together, it is just such an insanely cool feeling. I remember what that was like when I finished the first draft of the Aeon Academy back when I was like 14 or 15. It just felt magical. The next thing you should do is to take a break from the story. Again, this is all about following that second golden rule of trying to see your story as objectively as possible. I find that if I go straight from writing a first draft to then trying to edit that book straight away, I am not really seeing the story clearly because I've just been so wrapped up in the little details of it. So I like to take a break and work on something else to reset. This could be a short story, it could be outlining a longer story, it could be maybe writing a whole other book entirely. What's important here is that you just give yourself a little bit of a palate cleanser so that you can mentally reset and then come back into this project with fresher eyes. To give you some rough timeframes here, and of course these aren't like hard and fast rules by any means, Fires of the Dead, that had a 9-day break in between finishing the first draft and then going into the edit. Across the Broken Stars had several months, that's this book over here. The Thunder Heist had a 27-day break, and then Kingdom of Dragons had a 10-day break over here. And I'll tell you right now, 10 days was way too short. So Let me put this back here and I'll explain to you what the logic behind these breaks are. Oh, and then with the current project I'm working on, Sorrow of the Sun, which is the sequel to Kingdom of Dragons, I've given myself a break of several months, which is still ongoing. That is partly because I'm working on my first nonfiction book, Plotting Your Fantasy Novel, which is almost done. First draft should be done probably in about 2 weeks from now. Now, you might be wondering, okay, what is the logic behind how long I should leave my story to rest? And I would say, generally speaking, it depends on how long the first draft took. So for something like Fires of the Dead, that was quite a quick first draft to write. It's only a novella, it's about 23,000 words long, and so I didn't really need a huge break in order to mentally reset so that I could approach the story with fresh eyes. With Kingdom of Dragons, on the other hand, I said that that break was too short. That's because the first draft took me quite a few months to write. It was 163,000 words. And so 10 days was not enough time to mentally reset and recuperate from finishing that first draft. I really wish that I had had a longer break before coming back to that project. And again, that's why I'm trialing this with Sorrow of the Sun at the moment, giving myself a break of several months. We'll see how that goes. Okay, so once you've given yourself a bit of a reset, now it's time to read through your first draft again and take notes. Don't make changes at this stage. Again, remember, golden rule number 1, you want to work from biggest to smallest in terms of the issues and the problem solving in your manuscript. So don't make changes, just take notes. Something I find also useful in this scenario is actually to export my story from my computer onto my e-reader. So if you have a Kindle, there's a send to Kindle function. You can Google to see how this works. And that basically allows you to send a Word document onto your e-reader. The benefit of this is that it makes your story feel like it was written by someone else. Printing it out is also great as well. Obviously, this can be prohibitively expensive once you start making really, really long stories. I think I probably printed out more of my earlier novels with something like Kingdom of Dragons, which was, would have been 700 pages if I printed that thing out. I just did it on an e-reader. Maybe it would have been good to actually print it out in hindsight. You'll also see here that I suggest changing the font. Again, this is just about tricking your brain into imagining that someone else wrote this story. When it comes to actually taking notes on your first draft, I like to group these under general comments. So looking at bigger picture notes about my plot, my characters, my world building, my theme, maybe my dialogue, and maybe my prose as well. And then I like to do chapter by chapter comments that are specific to that chapter. To give you an idea of how long this has taken me in the past, with Kingdom of Dragons here, that was a 163,000 word long first draft. It took me 38 hours to read, over 39 days. I know this because I have a Excel spreadsheet where I track all of my writing time and my word counts in there. And then I ended up with about 20,000 words of editorial notes to myself. Up on the screen here, you can see what those editorial notes look like. I've redacted some areas to avoid spoilers, but basically I'm writing these as if I'm editing someone else's work. So I'm saying, you should consider this, or I'm confused about this thing here. I'm not saying, oh, I should fix this or I should fix that. Again, it's just about that second golden rule. Try to trick your brain into imagining that someone else wrote this story. To give you the timescales for another project here, if we look at The Thunder Heist, the first draft of this book came in at 64,000 words long, and it took me about 13 hours to read over the course of 7 days. My notes for this were only about 5,000 words long. Now you might be wondering, how come that's such a big difference from Kingdom of Dragons? Like Kingdom of Dragons is, maybe 2.5 times longer, but my notes are 4 times longer. Well, I generally find this is a very common pattern. The longer your story is going to be, it kind of creates this exponential increase in the difficulty of your edits. At least that's been my experience. So going from an 80,000 word book to a 160,000 word book, in my experience, it's not double the work, it's something like triple or even quadruple the work, which is, again, why I really suggest that if you're a new fantasy writer, you try to keep the scope and the scale of your first project relatively contained. And then as you progress, you can amp things up from there. Okay, so now that you've done your editorial notes, it's time to move on to the second draft. So the focus of this is all about big picture structural changes. And the first step of your second draft, if you haven't already done this, is creating quick chapter summaries. So I highly suggest doing this when you're writing the first draft, but if you haven't already, what I like to do is just give a few keywords about what happens in each chapter. This makes it really easy for me to sort of reference my manuscript and the table of contents at a glance, and I can instantly know, oh, okay, this is the chapter where that thing happens, so that's where I need to insert this new editorial change. Here's an example of what that looked like for Kingdom of Dragons. Don't worry, this is not a spoiler because I actually ended up cutting all of these chapters from the final story. I felt like they were dragging things too much at the start. But you can basically see here how I'm just writing the chapter number, the point of view character's name, the word count of the chapter, and then a brief summary of what happens. And if you're wondering how I did this, in Microsoft Word, you just highlight the chapter title, and then in the formatting section, change that to heading 1 type, and then it will automatically come up in the document pane on the side, so you can easily click those and kind of zoom around to the chapters in your story. The next thing you should think about in your second draft, if you haven't done this already, is to create a 1-page guiding principles document. So this is something that basically has the 1-sentence premise of your story, your theme, your main character's arcs, the high-level synopsis of what happens in the plot, and any other important notes. And the goal behind this is just to really clarify what is the core of your story. I see this all the time with writers I work with. They've been working on a story for months, maybe even years, and when they finish the story and they're looking at this thing and trying to figure out how to edit it, it feels really overwhelming because they don't know what's at the heart of this narrative. As soon as you can get really clear with yourself and identify what your story is and what your story should not be, then it gives you this tremendously useful filter for guiding your editorial decisions. Okay, so once you've done your chapter summary and your 1-page guiding principles document, the key questions to be asking yourself with your second draft are things like, do I need to add any scenes? Do I need to cut any scenes from my story? How is my pacing? Am I going too fast? Am I going too slow? Are my promises, progress, and payoffs aligned? So these are the 3 building blocks of story. I'm going to be talking about these a lot more in my upcoming nonfiction book, Plotting Your Fantasy Novel. But essentially, the start of your story sets up a promise about what we're going to experience. The middle of your story shows progress towards that promise. And then the payoff is the climax at the end where you resolve everything. And it's really important to make sure that these are aligned. So if you promise us one type of story at the beginning, you don't want to deliver a completely different type of payoff at the end. Now, if you do feel like something is a little bit off with your story at this stage, I find that it's really useful to use 9-point story structure as a quick diagnostic tool. So again, I'm going to be going into this in a lot more detail inside my Plotting Your Fantasy Novel book, but just to give you a quick overview of these 9 structural moments, the first moment is the opening hook. This is where you introduce your protagonist with a defining moment that establishes why we should care about them, and ideally hints at their flaws, their desires, and where their character arc is going to go. This leads to the inciting incident, which is where you disturb your protagonist's ordinary world by presenting them with some kind of challenge or some kind of invitation, some kind of calling to adventure. And that forces them onto a particular journey. It could be a physical journey like an actual quest, or it could be more of an internal one. Next, we have the entering the new realm moment, which is where your protagonist crosses some kind of threshold and steps into an extraordinary world where the rules of engagement are different and probably a lot more dangerous as a result. Our fourth plot point is the rising danger moment. This is where you show the danger and the threat of your antagonist and how they are uniquely skilled at exploiting your main character's specific weaknesses. Right in the middle of your story, you have your midpoint revelation. This is where your protagonist has an important epiphany about themselves. They might confront a truth they've been hiding from, or they might realize something about the nature of opposition that they are facing in the story. Our sixth plot point is the deepening pressure moment. So this is again where the antagonist comes back in, really applies some amplified, very critical pressure to your main character to test their sort of developing perspective, particularly if they've been maturing or growing as part of their character arc. And this drives your main character into a dark night of the soul moment where it seems like everything is lost. Moving on to plot point 7 here, the final spark. Just when everything seems lost, your protagonist encounters a key realization or a clue, or they have some kind of internal epiphany again that provides them with the final puzzle piece needed to defeat the antagonist and sets course for the final climactic confrontation, which of course takes us to plot point 8, the climax. This is the final showdown between your protagonist and antagonist, and only one of them walks away from this. Then, closing out our story, we have the closing image, plot point 9, which is basically about providing closure. And often it's really good to provide a bit of contrast against your opening image of your story, just to show how much your character has grown. So again, there's a lot of nuance to this. I think in my Plotting Your Fantasy Novel book, I've got probably 40,000, 50,000 words worth of writing just breaking down these different moments. So stay tuned for that book in the next few months if you want to have a deeper dive into this topic. Okay, so by the end of your second draft, there's still going to be problems in your story. There's no denying that. But ideally, the big picture of your story and your plot is really solid. Ideally, this means that all of your scenes are more or less locked, and that all of the point of views in your story, if you're using multiple point of view characters, are also locked as well. By this stage, the main conflict and the main plot of your story should be pretty solid. You may still be missing some subplots. That's okay, we can bring those in later in the editing process. And your side characters may feel one-dimensional still at this stage. You might also feel like your book is too long at this point because you've maybe added in these extra scenes and it feels a little bit bloated. That's all okay. We're going to be looking at how we can fix that in our future editing drafts. Okay, so moving on to your third draft. The way I like to think about this is refining my characters. So I'm basically looking at how I can build in more contradictions into my characters. So rather than just making them these very one-dimensional things where they're just about this one concept, see if I can build a bit of contradiction in. A great example of this comes from, where is it up here? The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. So Quoth has a very interesting contradiction woven into his character design where we see all these stories about him being this exceptional, magical prodigy in his youth. But when we kind of meet him in his older years, as he is narrating the story, he is this very mundane, run-down innkeeper. And that creates this contradiction within his character, where we want to know, how is it possible for these two extremes to exist within the same person? The other thing to look at in your third draft is to enhance your character arcs. So if you haven't already watched it, I've got a deep dive video called How to Write Character Arcs Better Than 99% of Fantasy Writers. Go check that out if you're struggling here, because there's a lot of depth and a lot of good examples in that video to learn from. The other thing to look at as well is to try and make each character's voice more unique, especially if you have multiple point of view characters. See if you can try and make each of their perspectives feel a bit more distinct. So ideally, if you have 3 point of view characters, the way that they describe the same setting or the same person or the same object should be subtly different based on what's important to them, what things they pay attention to, what things they ignore, and so forth. And of course, when it comes to differentiating your characters' voices, you also want to be thinking about that in terms of dialogue as well. Something else, which is a little detail, but I find it goes a long way here, is to try and give your characters unique physical tics. I know that in my first drafts, there's a lot of characters who might be frowning or sighing, and those tend to be very generic descriptions that I give to lots of my characters, but it can be really nice to look at ways to kind of just distinguish my characters from one another through the different verbal and physical tics they have. So rather than all my characters sighing when they're frustrated, maybe one of my characters like crosses his arms or, like scratches furiously at his hair or something like that. Those are probably bad examples, but you can see how just trying to create a small degree of differentiation here can make a character feel much more distinctive. And these are just little details to feed through your editing. Something else to think about here is giving arcs to your side characters, even if you don't plan to take those side characters on an arc. This is something I did in Kingdom of Dragons. There was a sort of stereotypical school bully figure at the Dragon Rider Academy in the story, and I just sat down one day and asked myself, why is he this way? And what would it take to kind of take him on a journey of transformation, to make him less of a prick and more of like a decent human being? And it made me realize all these things about his backstory and made me think, oh, like if I wanted to take him on an arc where he transforms and grows, here's what I would actually do to him. Now, I didn't necessarily do those things in the story, but just having it in the back of my mind allowed me to feed in a little bit more depth and a little bit more complexity to this character as I was editing. And on that note, you want to be thinking about ways to give your characters secrets, layers, and just more depth in general. One tool I find really useful for this is what I call the 4 selves analysis. So basically the idea behind this is that when we are going through life, this is for you, this is for me as well, we kind of have these 4 different personalities and these 4 different faces we show to the world. First of all, we have our social self. So this is who you and I are when we're around strangers, when we're around loose acquaintances. It's kind of like our public face that we present to the world. Then we have our personal self. So this is who you are when you are around people who are closer to you. So family, friends, loved ones, and so forth. Then you have your core self. So your core self is who you think you are when you are alone with yourself, alone with your thoughts, who you think you are in your own mind. And then buried beneath that, the deepest layer here is the hidden self. So this is the unknown, subconscious depth of who you truly are at your core. To give a quick example of this, if we look at Logan Ninefingers from Joe Abercrombie's First Law series, his social self is that he is the Bloody Nine. So he's this fearsome and legendary barbarian warrior from the north. His personal self is that he can actually be kind of philosophical and thoughtful when you get to know him. He has a lot of loyalty towards his friends, and he has this very deep desire to leave his bloody past behind. He has many regrets of things he's done in the past. His core self is that he really wants peace, but he's constantly dragged back into conflict and bloodshed by random circumstance or by his own reputation or by his own poor decisions. And his hidden self, I would argue, is actually his Bloody Nine persona. So it kind of loops back around to the start here. This is a aspect of himself that overtakes him when he's in moments of extreme danger or anger, and it sort of embodies this pure, uncontrollable violence that he both fears and tries to run away from, but also secretly deep down finds a lot of purpose in. Okay, so by the end of your third draft, which again is mostly about focusing on your characters, you should ideally have characters that feel much more real and interesting. And as a result, ideally the big picture and the sort of medium picture of your story, if that's even a word, is pretty solid. Again, there's still going to be plenty of flaws in your manuscript at this point. That is totally okay. That's totally normal. There's going to be a lot of typos at this stage because you probably shouldn't have been spending your effort trying to fix those typos when there were bigger issues involved in your story. Again, remember golden rule number 1. There may also be some scenes that are a bit too long and that sort of thing. Now, at this stage, you may find it's becoming a little hard to see your story objectively, which is why we get to the next stage here, which is to give it to early readers or pro editors. So I know it can be hard sometimes to find people who want to read your story, but it is such an important step and it makes a tremendously massive difference to the quality of your story. So the main tips I have for this is that you want to be giving your story to early readers or to editors when it's not quite finished in your mind. Because the issue and the mistake I see some new fantasy writers make is that they kind of give their story to an early reader or to an editor expecting a pat on the back, expecting that maybe there's going to be like, these little 1% tweaks to make throughout the story, but most of it's going to be pretty sound, right? And sometimes that can be the case, and if so, well done, that's fantastic. But more often than not, when you give it to early readers, particularly if this is your first book and you're a newer writer, you're going to find like there's a lot of comments that come back, and some of them may require you to make pretty drastic renovations to the story, maybe chopping out like 5 chapters or even rewriting a whole part of your story. And it's important that you do not approach this stage of the process thinking, my story is more or less finalized and ready to go. I just need a few quick notes from people before I can move on. Because that mindset really sets you up for a lot of harm when someone comes back with feedback that does require you to make some substantial changes. So still try to feel like you are quite early in the process at this stage. That's really, really important. I cannot emphasize that enough. Now, if you are giving your story to early readers, I find that it's really important to have them focus on giving you the problems or identifying the problems in your story, but not necessarily the solutions. The reason for that is that if you're giving your story to an early reader, maybe it's your partner or a friend or a colleague at work or just kind of a loose acquaintance you've met on some writing forum or in some writing community, that person may not necessarily be skilled at knowing how to craft a story or edit a story to fix certain problems. So if they're giving you a solution, then it might work, it might not work, but they might not be on the right track here. If, on the other hand, they identify a problem, there is no denying that that problem exists for them in that story. So the kind of easy way to think about this is that when an early reader identifies a problem, they are right for themselves 100% of the time. When they identify a solution, they might be right or they might not be right at how to fix it. Now, of course, if you're working with a pro editor here, this sort of flips around a bit. Editors are actually skilled and trained at knowing how to give you solutions to fix problems. But I just make that distinction because it's important that you are kind of accepting and dealing with feedback in the correct way. And we'll get into that a little bit more later in this video. If possible, it's good to stagger your feedback over multiple rounds. So if you do get into the position of having like the ability to have 10 early readers, which may be far too much for you right now, and that's okay. But if you are in that position where you can have a lot of early readers go through your story, don't give the book to them all at once. Try to break it down so that, 3 of them read one version. You go away, you incorporate their changes. Another 3 read another version. You go away, you incorporate their changes. This is going to allow for much faster development in your story. At this stage as well, it's a good time to take a break to reset. It can be a frustrating experience if you're just sort of twiddling your thumbs and waiting for early readers to get back to you. So this is a great time to go and work on another short story or outline another book or start writing another book entirely. Now, you might be wondering, Jed, what questions do you actually ask your early readers? How do you guide them through this process? Well, I like to ask the following 4 questions. Number 1, what was awesome about this story so that I don't accidentally delete it? Number 2, what was boring so that I do delete it or that I do change it? What was confusing? Were there things with the magic system or the world building that you just felt a little bit puzzled by? And then lastly, what didn't you believe? So this is mostly about character motivations. Maybe a character betrays your protagonist And a reader might say, you know what, I didn't really believe it. I didn't really believe that motivation at all. I got these questions from Mary Robinette Cowell, by the way. Really, really good resource. I've been using them for years. Okay, so to give some more tips for working with early readers here, the first most important point here, and I'm kind of laughing as I say this because I've seen this go wrong too many times, is that when you get feedback from someone on your story, just say thank you. Do not be tempted to try and sit them down and explain why the problems they've identified don't exist, or why they're misguided, or hang on, you actually said that this thing was confusing about the story, but I explained it, in sentence 10 of a 20-sentence paragraph back in chapter 1, 500 pages before it happened. So I probably sound like I'm ranting here a little bit, but I've definitely seen this with some writers. And the thing is, again, I cannot emphasize this enough. Whenever a reader tells you that there is a problem in your story, they are 100% correct from their perspective, right? So if a reader says, I had a problem with this, it does you no good to argue with it and say, no, you shouldn't have a problem with this because this, right? Even if you do manage to convince the reader, that's not something you can actually do when another reader sits down to go through your story. So it's really important to just approach feedback with a certain level of humility. It always stings, even to this day, for me, it still stings whenever I get early reader feedback, right? And people say, oh, this thing was a bit crap, or this thing didn't really make sense. And you have such a temptation to be like, but didn't you see this thing I said earlier? And the fact is, if your reader was confused by a payoff, even though you think that there was set up for it earlier, it means you have a setup problem. It means you need to go back and you need to fix it. You need to add in more instances of setup. You need to make things more clearer. Again, just approach feedback with humility. That's one of the most important things you'll take away from this video. Another thing here is that lack of data is data. So if you send your story out to a couple of readers and they give you like a lot of comments on the first 5 chapters, but then it feels like things kind of just fade away and they're not really reading the rest of your story, don't pressure them to keep going because they've actually told you something really important, which is that your plot as it stands right now, and this might sound harsh, but this is just the truth here, failed to capture them, right? It means that maybe there was something in these first 5 chapters that worked, but then they kind of got beyond that and the story was just too boring for them to want to continue. So lack of data is useful data in itself. A great way to get feedback on your stories is to find other authors who are at a similar level as you and then swap your stories with them in order to both give each other peer feedback. This is something we do in my Fantasy Writers Guild, which is my accountability and support community for writers. I'll link to that in the description down below if you want to check that out. Okay, so the 4th draft is all about processing the feedback from your early readers. So when it comes to incorporating feedback, the main thing to look for here is patterns. If you have a chapter and one reader hates it, one reader loves it, and one reader is indifferent, maybe you don't need to change that chapter that much. If, however, you have a chapter where all 3 of your early readers hated it, okay, now it's probably time to cut that thing. You do not have to accept every single piece of reader feedback that comes your way. Again, this is why it's so important to develop and train your own taste and judgment as a writer. The other thing to look at here is you want to try to figure out how you can solve the underlying symptoms or root causes of a problem rather than just the surface level expression of a problem. So for instance, you might have an early reader who says something like, you know what, I thought this 4th point of view character, her voice, it didn't sound that distinctive to me. Maybe you should have her make more witty asides and jokes so that she feels more different from the other 3 point of view characters. Now, an amateur writer might look at that feedback and go, oh, okay, cool, I'll do exactly what my early reader said. But you're not going to do that, are you? Because you've heard me say that you should be, not using early readers necessarily to identify these solutions. Instead, what you want to be looking at is going, okay, what's the underlying problem here? The underlying problem here is that this 4th point of view character doesn't feel meaningfully differentiated from the other 3 point of view characters. So I guess I could try to give them more distinctive, witty, jokes when we're in their perspective so they feel different. Or maybe I just cut this character, or I merge this character with my 2nd point of view character instead, and I kind of take aspects from both of them and combine them together. What you've done there is you're now thinking much more critically. You're thinking like a true author, right? You're looking at a problem and you're not just kind of treating it on the surface, but you're actually kind of diving deeper and going back to the root cause of why this issue is in your story. Okay, so once you've incorporated your early reader feedback, it is now time for the 5th draft, the polishing draft. And I'll tell you right now, before we get into this, and you'll see why later, personally, I think this is probably the funnest part of the drafting process. And I'll explain why in a moment. So this is where you're basically running your story through lots of different editing passes. So you might look at just trying to improve the dialogue in your story, or doing a chapter hooks pass where you're looking at the start and end of every single chapter and seeing if you should, adjust those to make it more compelling for readers to want to read on. You might look at setting enhancement tweaks. So maybe right now you've got a lot of scenes that just sort of take place in generic rooms. Is there a way you can go through your story and maybe set some of those scenes in more interesting locations as a way to show off, your cool world building, for instance? You can also look at something I call arc phrases. So these are sort of repeated sayings that echo throughout a story in order to build meaning. A classic example of this is, "May the Force be with you." That's said many times throughout Star Wars, and it gains deeper meaning and sort of deeper emotional resonance every time it's said. And then you might also want to be looking at tweaking your foreshadowing as well. So going back, seeing if you can layer in more little details and seeds and clues to set up later payoffs in your story. Now, when you're doing these different editing passes, I find that it's really important to just focus on doing one thing at a time. So I might be sitting down with my story and I might go to myself, okay, this week, over the next 7 days, I'm just going to focus on my dialogue. If I see any kind of other issue in my story, I'm just going to ignore it. I'm just focusing on my dialogue. Or, okay, for the next 3 days, I'm just looking at my chapter hooks, the start and end of my chapters. And I find that this is a really fun part of the editing process because it's allowing you to not have to stress about all these big picture things in your story and just drill down on these little details and really just polish them and make them as amazing as they can be. And when you do that enough times, you build up all these different layers of additional improvement to your story so that when you step back and look at the whole thing, your mind is blown. You're like, wow, this is so much better because of all these little tweaks I made. Something that is particularly important to look at this stage of your story is your prose passes. So I mentioned, in the earlier drafts in your story, not to really worry about the prose that much. And that's because you want to wait until everything is kind of locked in place before you start polishing the prose. That isn't to say you should skip the prose polishing because that is such an important step. The things that I find most useful for this, looking at reducing my adverbs. So adverbs are modifying words like the rain was extremely strong. Extremely is an adverb. And usually whenever you find an adverb in your writing, you can replace it with a stronger phrase. So instead of the rain was extremely strong, the rain raged against the window, rattling the glass. See how much more visceral and punchy that second example is? On a similar note, try to look at ways to show and not tell in your story. You can see with those two examples here, the rain was extremely strong versus the rain raged against the window, rattling the glass. Which example feels like you're showing? It's obviously the second one. The other thing to look at here is varying your sentence lengths. So if you have a bunch of sentences that are all the same length, it's going to create a kind of staccato rhythm in your story, and it's going to make it sort of more grating for readers to go through. Whereas if you have a short sentence, and then a much longer sentence, and then a medium sentence, there's much more kind of musicality, and the rhythm of your story will flow far, far better. Another thing to look at here is changing instances of passive voice to active voice. So for example, the door was opened by the grumpy barbarian is an instance of passive voice. If we change it to the grumpy barbarian kicked down the door, there's much more kind of activeness and punch to that sentence. Now, of course, there are times where you actually do want to create passive voice intentionally, but in most cases, the active voice is going to be stronger. Another thing to look at here is sticky sentences. Sticky sentences are where you have a lot of glue words in your writing. So words that don't really have much meaning in themselves, but are just used to connect other things together. So words like the, of, a, etc. These are words that are used to kind of join words together. And obviously they play an important role. But if you have a sentence with lots of, the light of the seven sons of the, you can just see how like those sort of sentences with a lot of glue words start to become a bit sticky and tough to read. And then of course you want to be looking at trying to get rid of cliches, get rid of overused words, and be more original in your phrasing. So of course the topic of prose is like a way bigger discussion than this video. I actually have a video called the 7 levels of prose every fantasy writer must master, where I go through this in a lot more detail. So definitely check it out. But in terms of editing your own story, the best tool I have found for this, and this is a tool I've actually been using since 2016 or 17, so I've used it for many of my books at this stage, is ProWritingAid, who are actually sponsoring today's video. And to show you how ProWritingAid works, I've pulled up their web app here. You can also use ProWritingAid. They've got extensions that you can use inside Word or Scrivener or wherever else you write. And I've written an intentionally bad example of prose here with lots and lots of mistakes in it, which I do not like at all. But you can see how they've got all these different writing reports that you can do up the top here. So if I click on the style report, it's going to show me all the adverbs that are used in this sample of the story. So you can see the adverbs here, they're kind of underlined there. And if I read this out, you can see why this is such an issue. Marcus bravely charged boldly into the pitch black darkness. So that's the kind of thing where you can just say Marcus charged, but you don't even need boldly. Marcus charged into the pitch black darkness. Gets the exact same message across, but it feels way less wordy. And then, things like his heart was beating rapidly like a drum. Rather than saying was beating rapidly, you could just say his heart hammered like a drum. And there's so much more impact to that phrasing. That's just one of the reports they have here. You can look at things like the sentence lengths, right? So it's showing like we've actually got quite a lot of long sentence here. Our average sentence length is 20 words, which is maybe a little bit on the longer side. Again, like with any tool, you're going to have some suggestions it gives you where you got to use your own judgment and just ignore them sometimes. But I find that it's really useful when I'm editing, and actually quite a fun part of my process is just to load my story into ProWritingAid and then basically just go through these different reports one at a time. There's a lot of interesting reports to dig into here. And even if, you only take a couple of notes or a couple of changes from these reports, it's just going to give you really free, easy ways to improve your story. So if you want to get access to ProWritingAid yourself, you can use my link in the description for a 20% discount. Thanks again to ProWritingAid for sponsoring this video. Okay, so this brings us on to the sixth draft. So this is generally the kind of final draft in my process, and this is all about proofreading and looking at your grammar. So this is where you fix all the typos. Earlier in this video, I said, don't worry about these until the story is fixed in place. Now you got to worry about these. So I find that it's really useful to read my story out loud, just verbally if it's short enough, or using Word's read aloud feature to get the computer to read your story to you. That makes it really easy to catch spelling mistakes or awkward phrasing, because sometimes when you're just looking at it on the screen, you don't notice these things. I also, again, find it really useful to change the font, to just trick my brain into thinking that I haven't been staring at this story for hundreds of hours already. I also find that sometimes it's useful when you're just trying to improve your grammar to actually read backwards. So take your first chapter, actually read the last paragraph first. So read that last paragraph in order, but then go to the second last paragraph and the third last paragraph and so forth. And this helps to avoid you skimming through the story, which again makes it easier to catch typos and spelling mistakes. Again, I find ProWritingAid's grammar tools quite useful here as well. Of course, with any of these tools, you're never going to have 100% accuracy. Sometimes it's going to give you suggestions that are a little bit off, but generally I find it to be pretty useful. And this is also where if you're self-publishing your story, you definitely want to bring in an external editor to proofread and clean up your book. So this brings us to the question of, when is the book done? When are you finished with editing? And to answer that, I want to share with you this quote. In the eyes of those who anxiously seek perfection, a work is never truly completed, a word that for them has no sense, but abandoned. And this abandonment of the book to the fire or to the public, whether due to weariness or to a need to deliver it for publication, is a sort of accident, comparable to the letting go of an idea that has become so tiring or annoying that one has lost all interest in it. That comes from Paul Valéry, hope I'm pronouncing that right, translated by Rosalie Maggio, and it kind of speaks to this idea that art is never finished, only abandoned. And so it's hard to know sometimes like when you are actually done with editing. But in my experience, it just comes down to when I notice that I'm at the point of diminishing returns, where I'm making changes to my story or I'm tweaking little things, but then I might untweak them or change them back to how they were before. I sort of realize that, okay, I've sort of reached the plateau of where this story is. And this is where it's just time to kind of take a hard look at your story and assess, is this good enough that I could try to seek publication for this, whether it is self-publication or going through a traditional publisher? Or is this just a book that right now I just need to accept, hey, this is a trunk novel, it taught me a bunch of stuff, it's time to move on to another project. One book is not the be-all and end-all of your writing career, whether you want to do this as a full-time career or whether you're just a hobbyist. Sometimes all your editing just won't lead to something that's good enough, or you might need to put a story away for a couple of years before you can know how to come back and fix it. With the very first book I wrote, The Aeon Academy, like I said, I spent a year writing that, and then I probably spent another 4 years editing and sometimes even rewriting it from scratch. And in the end, I realized, you know what? That book isn't quite there. And rather than that leading to despair, I just channeled all those lessons I learned from writing that book into writing Across the Broken Stars here, right? Which, because of all the things I'd learned from the Aeon Academy, it was so much better. And it now has almost 100 reviews on Amazon, which is really, really incredible. So as I always say in these videos, it just comes down to this. Keep writing and keep striving. I'll see you in the next video.